You've probably heard a story about water destroying the world. Maybe as a child, maybe in a religious text, maybe in a movie that felt strangely familiar even though you'd never seen it before. A flood that covered everything, that wiped out almost everyone, that left only a few survivors to start over. And if you heard this story, you probably didn't question it much. It was just there, part of the background, part of what people tell each other. But here's what's strange. If you talk to someone from a completely different culture, different continent, different religion, different language, they've heard a version of the same story. Not the same details, not the same names, not the same reasons why the flood came, but the structure is identical. Water rises, world drowns, a few survive, humanity begins again. Why does almost every ancient culture have a flood story? Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. Let's just list them for a moment. Not to prove anything, just to see the pattern. The biblical flood. Noah, the ark, 40 days and nights, a dove with an olive branch. Most people in the West know that one. But there's also the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia, written at least 1,000 years before the Bible. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a boat. A flood destroys humanity. He sends out birds to find dry land. The structure is nearly identical to Noah's story, so similar that scholars assume one influenced the other or both came from an older source. Then there's the Hindu flood myth. Manu is warned by a fish, actually the god Vishnu in disguise. He builds a boat. A flood destroys the world. He and 7 sages survive to repopulate humanity. Greek mythology has Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus floods the earth to destroy the corrupt Bronze Age of humanity. They survive in a boat, land on a mountain, repopulate the world by throwing stones that become people. Chinese mythology has Gunyu taming the Great Flood, a story that predates written records. Indigenous Australian Aboriginal stories describe a time when the seas rose and drowned the land. Some of these stories are so old they might actually preserve memories of post-Ice Age sea level rise from 10,000 years ago. Mayan mythology, Aztec, Inca, Native American tribes across North America, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Haida, Pacific Islander traditions, African stories from dozens of different cultures, all of them. Water rises, world drowns, few survive, world begins again. Now you might say, well, they're all describing the same event, a real global flood that actually happened. And some people do believe that. Take it as historical fact. But here's the problem. The geological evidence for a global flood that covered the entire Earth, every mountain, every continent, doesn't exist. We can trace ice ages, we can see meteor impacts, we can read volcanic eruptions in rock layers, but a worldwide flood that deposited a single continuous layer of sediment over the entire planet? No. So if it didn't happen, why does the story appear everywhere? Here's another possibility. Maybe they're all describing different local floods. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, flooded regularly, catastrophically sometimes. If your entire world is a river valley, and the river destroys everything you know, that is the world ending. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests that the Black Sea was once a smaller freshwater lake, and around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean broke through, flooding the area catastrophically. People living there would have seen their world drown. Coastal communities everywhere have experienced tsunamis, storm surges, rising sea levels. Any of these could generate a flood story. So maybe the story repeats because flooding repeats, because humans live near water, and water sometimes destroys them. That makes sense, but it doesn't fully explain the pattern, because the details are too similar, not just water came, but water came as punishment. A divine warning was given beforehand. A specific person was chosen to survive. Animals were saved in pairs. A boat was built. The survivors landed on a mountain. Humanity started over. That's not just, we remember a flood. That's a structured narrative, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, with moral weight, with theological implications. Why would completely separate cultures, who never met each other, create such similar narrative structures? Let's sit with the structure for a moment. The flood always comes because humanity is corrupt. or has angered the gods, or has violated some cosmic order. The flood is not random. It's intentional. It's a reset button. The world becomes so broken that it needs to be washed clean, returned to the beginning, started over, and one person or one family is warned, is told to prepare, is given the knowledge of what's coming. That person builds a boat, gathers animals, survives the destruction, emerges into a cleansed world. They are the new beginning, the fresh start, the remnant from which everything grows again. This is not a weather report. This is a narrative about cycles, about endings and beginnings, about the possibility of renewal after total collapse. Here's what's worth noticing. Flood myths don't appear in cultures that live in deserts far from water. They appear in agricultural societies, societies that depend on rivers, that live in floodplains, that know water as both life-giver and destroyer. For an agricultural society, water is everything. Too little and crops fail. Too much and everything drowns. The flood is the ultimate fear, the thing that sustains you becoming the thing that destroys you. But it's also the ultimate hope, because after a flood, the land is fertile again. The silt deposits nutrients. The fields are renewed, the flood destroys, and then the flood nourishes. So maybe the story isn't about a historical event at all. Maybe it's about the psychological experience of living with water, of knowing that the source of life can also be the source of death. And maybe it's about something even deeper. Think about what a flood does. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your status, your wealth, your power. The king's palace and the peasant's hut both drown. A flood is the great equalizer, the ultimate leveling force. And in the story, the world before the flood is always corrupt, always unjust, always in need of destruction. The flood wipes the slate clean, returns everything to zero, and the survivor, the person on the boat, is not usually the most powerful. They're the righteous one, the one who listened to the warning, the one who prepared. The flood myth is a story about moral order being restored, about the powerful being brought low, about starting over on better terms. That's not geology, that's theology. And maybe more importantly, that's politics. Here's a thought that might make both religious and secular people uncomfortable. What if flood myths aren't about remembering the past? What if they're about imagining the future? What if the flood story is less, this happened once, and more, this could happen again? Because the structure of the myth is not just descriptive, it's prescriptive. It says the world can become so corrupt that it must be destroyed. It says there will be warning signs. It says those who listen will survive. It says renewal is possible, but only through total collapse. That's not history. That's eschatology. That's a vision of how the world ends and begins. And maybe humans need that vision. Maybe we need to believe that when things get bad enough, there's a mechanism for reset, a way to start over, a flood that washes everything clean. Let's look at what happens after the flood in these stories. The survivors make a sacrifice. They thank the gods. They make a covenant, a promise that this won't happen again, or a promise about how to live differently. In the Noah story, God sets a rainbow in the sky as a sign that he won't flood the earth again. In other versions, the gods promise restraint, or humanity promises obedience. The post-flood world is not the same as the pre-flood world. There's been a change, a transformation, a new agreement about how things work. The flood is not just destruction. It's a rite of passage, a transition from one age to another. Humanity before the flood, innocent or corrupt, but in either case, not yet mature. Humanity after the flood, tested, reduced, but wiser, chastened, reformed. The flood is baptism on a civilizational scale. Here's another angle. Psychologically, the flood myth might be about trauma, not a specific historical trauma, but the universal human experience of catastrophe, of everything you know being swept away: war, famine, plague, exile, economic collapse, environmental disaster. Every generation experiences something that feels like the world ending, and in the aftermath, survivors have to rebuild, have to start over, have to make sense of why they lived when others didn't. The flood myth gives structure to that experience. It says destruction can be total, but survival is possible. It says the new world will be different from the old. It says we are the remnant, carrying forward what matters. That's not describing a flood. That's describing the psychological work of recovering from any catastrophe. The story provides a template, a way to think about endings and beginnings. A narrative that makes devastation bearable by framing it as renewal. Now here's where it gets even stranger. Modern secular culture has its own flood myths: climate apocalypse, nuclear winter, pandemic collapse, asteroid impact, AI existential risk. Different mechanisms, same structure. The world becomes unsustainable. Warnings are ignored. Catastrophe comes. Most of humanity perishes. A small group survives, either the prepared, the lucky, or the chosen. They rebuild civilization from scratch. We tell these stories constantly, in movies, in books, in news articles, in political rhetoric. And we tell them with the same emotional weight as ancient flood myths, the same sense that the current order is corrupt and must be swept away, the same warning that only those who prepare will survive, the same promise that after collapse comes renewal. We've secularized the flood, replaced divine wrath with environmental or technological catastrophe, but the narrative structure is identical, which raises a question. Are we describing real risks? Or are we retelling a story we've been telling for thousands of years because something in us needs to tell it? Maybe both. Maybe the reason flood myths appear everywhere is because flooding really happens, and also because the flood story serves a psychological and social function that humans need. It's not either or, it's both. The story is rooted in real experiences of water-destroying communities. But it's elaborated into mythology because that mythology does something. It provides a framework for understanding catastrophe. It creates a moral narrative around destruction. The wicked are punished, the righteous are saved. It offers hope that after total collapse, renewal is possible. It functions as a warning: fix what's broken or face the consequences. And it creates a sense of chosenness or survivorship for those who tell the story. We are the descendants of those who survived. We carry their knowledge. We won't make their mistakes. Let's notice something else. The flood is always described as lasting a specific amount of time. 40 days and 40 nights in the Noah story, a week in some versions, a specific number of years in others, and then the water recedes. Dry land appears. A bird brings back a sign that it's over. The flood is not permanent. It's a period, a season, a transitional state, which suggests the story is not really about water. It's about time, about the period between one age and another, about the waiting, about the uncertainty of not knowing when it will end. The people on the boat are in liminal space, not in the old world, which has been destroyed, not yet in the new world, which hasn't emerged. They're floating, suspended, waiting for the water to recede so they can begin again. That's the human experience of being in crisis, of waiting for the crisis to pass, of not knowing how long it will last or what will remain when it's over. The flood myth is a map for enduring that waiting. Here's another uncomfortable thought. What if the flood myth is popular because deep down we want it to happen? Not consciously, not literally, but psychologically, because the world as it is feels broken, unjust, exhausting, unsustainable. And the idea of a clean slate, of everything being washed away and starting fresh, is appealing. The flood myth gives permission to fantasize about total collapse, to imagine the end of the current order, to envision a world where all the accumulated problems, all the systems that don't work, all the corruption and injustice, gone. Reset, washed clean. Of course, we also fear it. We don't actually want to live through catastrophe, but there's a part of us that wants what comes after. The renewal, the simplicity, the fresh start. The flood myth lets us hold both desires. The desire for the current world to end, and the desire to survive into the new one. So why does every culture have a flood story? Maybe because every culture lives with water, and water at sufficient scale is terrifying. Maybe because every culture experiences catastrophe, and the flood is a perfect metaphor for catastrophe, sudden, total, indiscriminate. Maybe because every culture needs myths about endings and beginnings, about moral order being restored, about the possibility of renewal. Maybe because the flood story serves a function. It warns, it explains, it consoles, it creates identity. Or maybe because the story is encoded in something deeper, in human psychology, in our relationship with water, with time, with mortality, with the fear that everything we've built is temporary and fragile. The flood story is not one story. It's many stories that share a structure, and that structure appears everywhere, not because it happened everywhere, but because it means something everywhere. You've probably heard a story about water destroying the world, and now maybe you're hearing it differently. Not as history, not as prophecy, but as something else. A story humans tell when they need to think about endings, about starting over, about what survives when everything else is swept away. The flood is not coming. The flood has always been coming. The flood is the story we tell ourselves about living in a world that could end at any moment but keeps going. And the boat is not a boat. It's the part of you that believes you'll survive, that knows how to hold on, that's prepared to rebuild when the water recedes. Every culture has a flood story, not because the same flood happened everywhere, but because the same need exists everywhere. The need to believe that even total destruction is not final, that even when the world drowns, something survives, that even the end is a beginning. If this raised something for you, an agreement, a disagreement, or even just a question, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Not answers, just what this brought up for you. I read them. Please subscribe, like, and share. This helps us grow and create more interesting content like this one.